From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing author interview. Our guest today, not exactly the author of this book, he's the editor of this book, although he wrote several parts of it, is Ryan Bourne. He is the R. Evan Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute, and the book is called The War on Prices. It is an anthology of different essays from many different authors, but Ryan wrote a couple of them and was the one who pulled it all together. So thanks so much for being with us today, Ryan.
Great to be with you, Dominic.
All right, so the first question is the war on prices. Who are the combatants and which side is winning?
Well, the combatants really are primarily government, state, local, and federal, as you'd probably expect, given this is about the way in which governments are attacking market prices in various ways. I think based on a number of different misconceptions and faulty ideas about what drive prices and what drive inflation. But I think the really crucial point for the hook of this book is that we've just lived through a period in which inflation has been higher than any year since 1981. As a result of that, people's grocery prices have gone up 21% in the last 3 years. People are now paying 7.5% for new 30-year fixed mortgages. That inevitably brings a lot of public angst. And as a result of that public angst, politicians and to a lesser extent central bankers have a very strong incentive to deflect blame onto malevolent actors or external factors, whether that be the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, or whatnot, for the inflation that we've lived through. And when that occurs, when they're devising that narrative, it really lends itself to seeing dealing with inflation as something to do with microeconomics rather than macroeconomics. So this idea that you can, fiddle with infrastructure policy or antitrust policy, or at its very worst, directly control prices, individual prices, in order to combat inflation. So I became aware of the fact that inflation itself had led to a lot of these bad ideas about prices and how to control the price level manifest themselves. But then when I thought about it more intensely, I realized that actually there was a kind of lower level war on prices going along in much of the country already, where we've seen a return of rent control in various major states, California, Oregon. We've seen big increases in the minimum wage across much of the country over the past decade, seen anti-price gouging statutes proliferate, and of course, Joe Biden's war on junk fees. So you put it all together, and I think the war on prices is an attempt to kind of subvert market prices across many sectors of the economy through a whole range of direct controls on prices, controls on pricing structures, and just general bad ideas about what caused prices. And that's become worse as a result of the inflationary environment we've lived through.
And so in this assault on prices, are the people making the assaults doing well? Is it working, or are prices ultimately winning out on the other side?
That's a great question. Well, when it comes to the price level and inflation, obviously we've got through this period and we didn't reinstitute economy-wide price controls that we saw under Richard Nixon or World War II. So, in that sense, we should be grateful for small mercies. That said, I think this period has led to a growing acceptance of the idea. Indeed, polling now suggests that the modal answer to who is to blame to inflation among Americans is greedy corporations. And that's clearly worrying for, if a future inflationary period arises, that's a kind of worrying backdrop. And you could imagine that politicians would kind of take advantage of that. More broadly, though, I think we are seeing, when it comes to individual level market price controls, we are seeing a proliferation of them across the economy. I do think you're seeing, even in the periodicals, some of the magazines, big attacks on kind of dynamic pricing, algorithmic pricing, this idea that every American is being kind of nickel and dimed in all of the purchases they're making, and kind of Joe Biden's war on junk fees, as it were, is kind of capturing the imagination of many commentators, at least. I don't know whether the general public care about it too much. And I just think the general mood music is antithetical to this idea that market prices are, a really important coordinating mechanism for economic activity. So I'd say we're kind of, those of us who think that market prices are important are kind of on the back foot at the moment. But it feels like a time to come out and make this defense now before we lose too much ground.
That's something that we definitely focus on here at Capital Matters. The importance of market prices. William F. Buckley Jr. said that the competitive price system is indispensable to human liberty. And so, why is it that we think prices are so important? What is it that a price contains? What is it that a price makes possible that is so vital to human society, really?
I think the key role is that prices are essential for coordinating economic activity. And what is a market price? Well, if you look in a dictionary, the definition of a price would be something like the monetary amount that a seller or producer charges for a good. But that's not really what we're getting at when we talk about a market price. We're talking about the market price as a signal, the bottom-up manifestation of information, all the information out there of supply and demand factors in the economy. So you think of a price of bread, for example, that doesn't just reflect the cost of manufacturing that bread. It reflects the extent of the harvest. It reflects what's going on in agricultural markets in terms of the equipment needed to realize that harvest. It reflects weather patterns on the supply side. It reflects shipping of certain goods, transport costs across the economy. On the demand side, it reflects income levels. It reflects whether we're living through any fads at the moment where people are kind of hostile to carbs, a whole range of different supply and demand factors. So a price is really, an individual market price is really an aggregator of all that different information that no one individual would be able to collect. And that plays a crucial role in coordinating economic activity because, when I go into a store and recognize that market price and see that market price and think about it within my own budget constraint, it leads me to make decisions about how much I want to purchase or for suppliers, how much they want to change their production levels based on the information that they're getting from that market price. So, a few years ago, there was an instance where a factory for baby formula was kind of temporarily closed down as a result of some contamination. There was a big kind of short-term shortage, a lot of baby formula missing from shelves, and the price of baby formula went up. And, that's evidently kind of bad news for consumers of baby formula. Nobody pretends that that supply shock was anything other than bad news. But the change in the price reflected that information. So it meant that, when an individual went into a supermarket, they didn't need to know what was going on with an individual factory and what was causing that price increase. They just saw the price increase and thought, maybe this is not the best time to, to buy 3 months worth of baby formula. Maybe I'll just take what I can get right now. At the same time, it encouraged other producers of baby formula to try and ramp up production, perhaps pay overtime, pay those truck drivers a bit more to ensure that they can make as many deliveries as possible, perhaps even for some foreign suppliers to try and actually get through the hurdles of the FDA regulations to be able to export into the US market at the time. So the price mechanism and price changes incentivize changes in our behavior so that we can continue to utilize goods and services and resources efficiently. So I really like Alex Tabarrok's kind of summary of this. He says a price is a signal wrapped in an incentive. And the problem with this, of course, is that if we really do believe prices are essential messengers of information, the flip side of that is when we attempt to control prices, we're essentially holding a gun to the messenger's head and getting them to tell us a comforting lie about the realities of the world. And that tends to lead to bad outcomes.
Yeah, I sort of always like the facetious kind of argument of a First Amendment case against price controls. That price controls, you're suppressing information, you're reducing, free speech. It shouldn't be allowed. But when we talked about the baby formula problem that we had a couple of years ago, that's sort of been a lingering problem for a long time because the government has suppressed prices in the baby formula market. They do that through the WWII program, which now accounts for over half of all baby formula purchases in the United States. And so over half of consumers of baby formula are not price sensitive. So they don't have to pay attention to this because it's being paid for through a government program. And then, of course, the government also blocks nearly all imports of baby formula. so the producers don't have to compete with each other as much as they otherwise would either. And so when we're, as you said, it was a terrible thing when it happened, and I think that helps to illustrate why price controls are a problem, because you know there's plenty of other industries where if there's a problem in one factory somewhere, that doesn't cause a crisis. It doesn't cause shortages everywhere because there's other producers to fill in, and consumers are price sensitive, and so they'll respond in a way that doesn't result in sort of widespread shortages. So,
Yeah,
um,
that's a great point. So, you could almost write a second book. Most of this book is focused on governments kind of directly controlling prices, kind of after the event. But you're certainly right that there's a hell of a lot that government does to distort what the price would be relative to its market price to start with. So that often comes with regulations on the supply side that make it more difficult for producers, essentially make it more difficult for producers to provide goods to market, like on housing, land use and zoning laws are the kind of obvious examples. So they make the supply more inelastic and unresponsive to changes in demand. And you're certainly right, on the demand side, a lot of extensive government subsidy programs make consumers less sensitive to prices, and so that those subsidies that kind of increase demand at the same time as you're squeezing supply obviously push up the underlying market price, and so particularly consumers who don't benefit from the subsidy programs end up paying much more, and that actually animates a lot of the calls then for real world price controls that we see. So this stuff is definitely interlinked. Maybe if I have time to put together a second book, it would be all the ways that governments raise the underlying market price, which leads to demands to control them.
Yeah, one of the real world examples I think people most relate to is gasoline prices, because gasoline prices are so ubiquitous. Just wherever you are driving around, you see them on signs. So it's very easy to compare what they are in different places and what they are over time. And so we remember, for example, the energy crisis in the 70s, where we had rationing, odd even rationing with license plates and things like that, and we had price controls. And so rather than letting the price go up as it would have, the government said, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to do all this rationing stuff. And people really hated that. They were not fans of that. But when we had more recently, we've had gas prices go up, whether it's because of the war in Ukraine or earlier in like the 2010s, there was that brief period where we had gas over $4 a gallon nationally. There we allowed the price to go up, but we didn't have any of these big lines of cars waiting for gasoline. We didn't have the odd even rationing because we let the price mechanism sort out that allocation problem. Um, Obviously, high gas prices aren't popular either, but it seems to be that was less unpopular than the 70s outcome with the rationing and the odd even license plates and the big lines of people and people stealing gasoline from each other's gas tanks. It was crazy. So what do you think the sort of political calculation is behind those more direct things? And do you think that maybe because of the failure of the more direct approaches in the past, like you said before, we didn't have economy-wide price controls this time around in inflation. Do you think there's at least a little bit of politicians learning a lesson from that and saying, actually, that's a really bad way to go about it, and we'd rather have this, still not great, but at least not terrible outcome instead?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. This time with the high gas prices, what you saw was, progressives in Congress basically saying we should have a federal anti-price gouging law, whereby we investigate what's going on in gasoline markets. So there was much less of a reach for direct price controls, and as you say, I think that's because oil and gas price controls in the 1970s, and they were in place for almost all of the 1970s, were proven to be a failure, and not just because they led to the traditional impact of price controls where you hold a price below the market rate and it leads to shortages. Yes, we did see shortages in heating oil in 72, 73, in 73, 74. And then, of course, for gasoline as well, we saw those gas station lines, particularly in early 1979. But I think one of the big things we actually learned from that 1970s experience was that price controls kind of facilitate a whole lot of political corruption almost, a whole lot of lobbying, a whole lot of favoritism, because actually for a lot of the period, it was only about 60 to 70% of the market under price controls. And although that did hold prices below market levels, those price controls were actually incomplete. There were certain exemptions for kind of new oil and gas production. There were different regimes for imports at various times. This was all incredibly complicated and changed pretty dramatically. But the primary effect was actually a lot of surplus that was transferred from domestic crude oil producers to refiners, some of which at various times benefited consumers who were able to then find gasoline, but with big deadweight losses to the economy. So I think coming out of that, a lot of people realized not only did these price controls risk shortages, and there certainly were shortages at particular times, but it set up an incredibly complex regime. Which was self-evidently kind of politically toxic as well, and really, really difficult to administer. And so I don't think it's any surprise that now when we see big spikes in the gas price, yes, politicians want to show that they care about it by saying we should have an investigation, the FTC should investigate this, or we should have an anti-price gouging law, so we really assess these firms' costs and try to work out what's going on. But we don't see those direct calls for price controls. And I think that is due to the dreadful experience we had in the 1970s.
Yeah, my economics professor in college, Tom Ristisi at George Mason University, who talked about the example of the 70s and people who were, using tubes to siphon gas out of other people's gas tanks. And he said, anytime you have a government policy that is leading you to believe that it's a rational decision to possibly inhale gasoline, it's probably a really bad policy. One of the other historical policies that you talk about in the book is World War II price controls. A lot of people who support price controls might point to that and say that was a successful example of price controls working, because during the war, government had to step in. They had to make sure that people could get what they needed on the home front, but also have enough to supply the war effort. And so government came in and managed prices. And hey, the Allies won World War II, so it must have worked. And then after the war was over, we got rid of the price controls. So what's the big deal? What do you think is what is your take on the World War II price controls and the experience there?
Well, certainly when you're in a mass mobilization war, you're kind of putting economic efficiency to the side in service of a greater goal, which is trying to defeat Hitler when it comes to World War and the Japanese when it comes to World War II. And one could imagine that if you're kind of printing lots of money to buy up lots of commandeer lots of kind of goods and services, and you want to keep people's inflation expectations under control, you can hold down prices as a means of trying to do that, and impose extensive rationing to make sure people get certain things. My big picture take on that is that the people that look at that and say that was a really successful period ignore the reams of evidence which suggests that actually a lot of that inflationary pressure was just suppressed in various ways rather than ameliorated. Ultimately, inflation is about the balance between the amount of money in circulation chasing goods and services and the amount of production. And during wartime, there was lots of inflationary policies. Now, as a result of prices being controlled, eventually across most of the economy, when most price controls were essentially banned, producers had to kind of adjust to that in various ways. Some of the ways that they adjusted to it was to reduce the quality of the products to reflect the new price that they're able to charge. So you have tons of stories during World War II of, meat that was incredibly tough that nobody could cut, sausages filled with corn. There was extensive shrinkflation. Clothing products hugely declined in quality. So even the Office for Price Management, Office for Price Administration at the time, it kind of admits that there was big declines in kind of quality. There are extensive black markets because, of course, if you get in the way of sellers who are willing to sell at a particular price and consumers who are willing to buy at the same price, and you kind of ban that legally, it kind of incentivizes people to do it in black markets. So there was extensive black markets, particularly for imported goods at the same time. So much so that the one of the officials at the OPA at the time kind of said that there was such extensive conniving that he had to question the moral fiber of Americans in not being willing to stick to price controls. And indeed, I believe there were more civil cases on under price control legislation at a federal level than all other federal civil charges kind of combined. So quite extensive issue, and of course there were extensive shortages. Journalists at the time documented having to go to 7 different stores before they could find a soda, and there was extensive rationing. So big impositions on freedom, big reductions in the availability and quality of products, and extensive black markets. And that of course all meant that when price controls were removed in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the price level spiked to quite sharply to indicate the fact that underlying inflation was actually there. Now, some people kind of then go from that and say, well, actually, the poor did relatively okay during World War II. If you look at like their eating habits and stuff, they seem to do pretty well, and indeed they ate more meat, for example, during Second World War than pre World War II. But actually, if you look at kind of things like meat consumption after price controls were removed, it continued to increase. And if you look at kind of people's consumption patterns rather than income, which is, of course, is incredibly difficult concept, national income, to examine during World War II, because prices weren't market prices for lots of things, and a lot of stuff being produced was for the government, things that the government was buying administered rather than market prices. But if you look at people's consumption patterns, consumption jumped pretty dramatically from 1946 onwards, when price controls were removed. So I just think this story that people tell, that price controls were a success because they held down prices during the period they were being controlled, and then they went up again when price controls were removed, ignores lots of the adjustments that were being made and paints like a Panglossian picture as to what was going on with people's consumption habits.
And anytime you're yearning for the return of World War II, that's probably a bad place to be. One of the other most common price control stories is about rent controls. Obviously, people are upset about the price of housing right now, and we've seen some local governments sort of going back to price controls. First of all, is there an area of economic research with more literature than price controls? And second of all, what does that literature say?
No, I think rent control is the most deeply studied price control through history. Especially through the 20th century, there was extensive literature on this, and pretty much, I mean, there was a recent meta study in a European journal that kind of went through, and pretty much the price control literature for rent control shows exactly what Econ 101 would predict. If you hold rents or rent increases below those that would otherwise result in a free market, the first order effect seems to be that you get shortages. Holding rents below market rates increases the quantity demanded of rental accommodation. More people think, I want to rent, because the price is being held below market rates. But at the same time, of course, that encourages landlords to, on the margin, move more of their properties to sell them for owner occupation, put them onto Airbnb rather than do kind of longer term rents, perhaps live in the properties themselves, rent them out to family members, off market, as it were, and a whole range of other adjustments that mean that you get this disconnect between the quantity demanded and quantity supplied, so you get shortages. And the quintessential example of this is in Stockholm, where they've had these types of tight rent controls for decades, and they now have in the city centre of Stockholm have 20-year waiting lists for rental accommodation. Now, clearly not all rent controls bind as tightly as that, but directionally you tend to get that effect. But it's not just shortages. We've known for a long time that if you hold rents below market rates, one thing that you incentivize landlords to do is not do as much maintenance, upkeep, redevelopment, and allow the effective rental price for that property to fall towards the control price. So, if you're thinking of replacing a bathroom, for example, you might think, well, if I'm not going to be kind of compensated for this by my rents, being able to put up my rents, then perhaps I won't engage in that investment. So, New York rent control accommodation on a bunch of objective metrics tends to be much lower in quality and amenities than in other cities where markets dictate rents. And then at the same time, of course, as with other price controls, you get black markets and other ways of people allocating properties. If you're not able to ration by changing rents, and then you do some of that through quality instead, but some of it may be through bureaucracy. You may determine that you want your potential renters to submit a personal statement by which you can glean information about the likelihood that they're going to damage the property, or the likelihood that they're going to kind of move out within a given period of time if you're able to change rents between tenancies. So there are all sorts of other ways that landlords adjust to try and mitigate their risks, given that they can't reflect those risks in the prices that they charge.
So one of the problems that we can see in prices just from economic theory is, you have the equilibrium price, which is the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve. When that price is higher, suppliers are happier because the producer surplus, the wedge on the graph, that's the benefit to producers gets bigger. When the price is lower, the consumer surplus gets bigger, so consumers are happier. So at any given market price, the suppliers will always be happier if the price was higher, and the consumers would always be happier if the price was lower. This works out in lots of different ways. Asking for regulation to try to get it to be either higher for the suppliers or lower for consumers, and then obviously the competitive responses as well. But this fundamental tension right here sort of keeps everybody sort of in competition with each other. Is that necessarily a good thing, do you think, for getting along with each other? Because if we have this, if we have this system that's set up where people will always be upset because it could always be a little bit lower or a little bit higher. Do you think that's a source of unrest or sort of problems between people?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a fundamental point that we kind of touch on at various stages of the book. So, prices in reality are constantly changing and moving, and we're never quite in equilibrium. You're kind of heading there at any given time, given supply and demand shocks. But you're right, trades tend to take place when a consumer feels like they get more value from the good or service they're buying relative to the price they're paying. And the producer thinks that they get more value from selling the good or service. Relative to their cost of production. So trades are by definition mutually beneficial. But one kind of consequence that comes from that is that, if we're quite sophisticated, and, a lot of people think they're sophisticated in the way they think about the economy, if you know that the other person is getting a bit of a surplus, the producer is getting more than they kind of value holding the product by selling the product to you, then in some ways that they could charge a bit less. Or, if you're a producer, that because the consumer is getting some consumer surplus from the purchase, they could pay a bit more. And so there's this inherent kind of tension there, I think, that arises, where everybody thinks, well, yes, I am feeling benefits by my own lights by engaging in this trade. But, he really could have sold that to me for just a bit less than he did. And so you're right. I think there's an inherent kind of tension there that means that market trades, although they clearly make us better off, otherwise we wouldn't engage in them, you can kind of still leave them a lot of the time thinking, maybe I could have paid a bit less for that, or maybe I should have received a bit more. And I think that does animate some of these calls for regulation. Now, I don't think there's any inherent way of getting around that. It's just the inherent nature of market trades. But I think it's a kind of underexplored point, and kind of one that people haven't really analyzed and assessed in the literature. And Deirdre McCloskey and I first thought about this over a lunch. We said, well, why is it that market prices so often drive people crazy, even though they're self-evidently the bottom-up manifestation of people's individual decisions to engage in purchasing goods and services. And this was one of the explanations that we came up with. So I don't have an answer as to how you kind of circumvent it, but I think that's definitely a underlying source of tension here.
When a consumer goes and pays that price that they might think could be a little bit different, a company could respond to that and say, well, we should have personalized pricing, right? We should make sure that you are getting the exact price that you are willing and able to pay, and that somebody else, if they're willing and able to pay a different price, they should be able to be charged that price. And then we'd have more people would be lined up right with what they're supposed to pay, so to speak. But as you mentioned towards the start of this, things like dynamic pricing, things like that sort of personalized pricing are often really unpopular with people, and that makes people also feel like they're getting ripped off because they're like, well, wait a minute, why I'm paying for the same thing? Why is this other person paying a different price for it than I am? Even though you could say that, well, it's because your demand for the good is different than their demand for the good, and so the actual market price would be different. But we've sort of settled on a lot of companies have settled on, you have one price for the product and everybody pays that price. Why is it you think that that sort of attempt to make it more fair often feels less fair?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So if you go back, Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, and Richard Taylor, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, did a bunch of survey experiments in the 1980s where they asked people a bunch of different questions to try to assess how people thought about fairness when it came to market pricing. And one of the questions they asked people, I'm paraphrasing here, went along the lines of, there's a store that sells snow shovels and there's a snowstorm coming. And the day after the snowstorm, they increased the price of a snow shovel, this store, by 20%. Now, clearly, that's a result of a demand shock, like demand for. Let's presume that there's no supply shock here, so it's not the result of they're not able to get new snow shovels into the store. This is like a pure demand shock, and like 80 to 90% of people, I can't remember exactly, opposed that price rise and said it was unfair, inherently unfair. And I think that's reflective of the fact that a lot of us just seem to think it's illegitimate for a firm to charge more when there's been a change in the demand context rather than the supply context, by which I mean basically firms' costs of production. And I think this kind of helps explain some of the inherent opposition to dynamic pricing, which is really just a form of price discrimination temporarily, over time. And I think it explains a lot of people's unease with personalized pricing, which is it really just be an attempt by firms to capitalize on people's different willingness to pay, extending the kind of airline principle whereby, certain people who are much more fussy about where they sit on airplanes or whatever, or their queuing position when it comes to Southwest or whatever, are willing and able to pay more for those kind of privileges. So this is definitely a source of kind of price intention. Now, there are evident benefits to personalized or dynamic pricing in the sense of, is a truer reflection of the underlying supply and demand for the product. And it helps avoid, in many cases, kind of waste. If you think about a supermarket, for example, it charges the same prices all day, but when you go in at like 6 p.m. after work, there's always a line that's about 20 to 25 minutes long here in DC to get your shopping. Supermarkets end up throwing away lots of food. Sometimes they have flash sales on certain things when they're going out of date, but a lot of food is thrown away when it's past its use by dates. You can imagine a situation where if you had more dynamic pricing, you could kind of smooth that out to more kind of accurately reflect the inherent kind of worth of the good given the use by date. So there are all sorts of downsides to uniform pricing, but it doesn't make sense for every business to charge fully dynamic pricing. And that's because on the consumer side, obviously there are kind of search costs if you don't know what the price of a good or service is going to be every time you walk into a store. Now, you can imagine that phones get around this a lot. So you could have, just quickly look on a website at how much something's going to cost. But if I walk into the local sandwich store across the road from Cato, which is where I get my lunch most days, and every day the price changes dramatically because there's a conference over at the Marriott, and all of a sudden my normal, $12 sandwich is like $35 or whatever. That imposes a big search cost on me, and that I then have to like walk to Potbelly down the road and see what's going on with their prices if that's not immediately available information online. So there are good reasons why consumers might dislike dynamic pricing, and actually it might be within firms' interest, given those underlying search costs, to have uniform pricing. But I don't think that there should be a kind of blanket objection to it. And the reason there shouldn't be a blanket objection to it is because if you believe in capitalism and you believe that a lot of this stuff will increase profit opportunities for firms, that in itself will induce new entry into the sector and a more kind of new entrants kind of realizing that this is a better way of doing things, who will come in and compete and may actually end up pushing underlying market prices down. Not to mention the fact that having dynamic pricing can give people who are willing to pay less much more access at off-peak times to begin with. So there are both benefits to certain types of consumers, often low-income consumers, to personalized pricing, particularly at off-peak times. But that, if we believe in the power of market competition and think the markets are fairly competitive, then just because a firm is all of a sudden able to charge dynamic pricing does not mean that you're going to get permanently elevated profits in that sector. Indeed, it's going to induce more entry to the sector. So you're right, it's definitely an area that people worry about a lot, and I think it comes from that opposition to demand drivers for pricing rather than supply drivers. But it's quite a complex area, and ultimately you have to let markets play this out, right? So you have to let firms innovate around pricing like anything else and work out what it is that consumers desire. Do they desire a certainty of supply, like with Uber, where you want to allow the price to adjust? Or do they desire much more certainty in price, like when you go to buy lunch at lunchtime?
So, one of the prices that people have been talking about recently is interest rates. Interest rates are the price of money. This is sort of a weird price because, first of all, it is the price of the ability to pay for other things. So it's a kind of a different way than just the price for a good directly. But also, it's a price that is influenced heavily and in some senses set by central banks, by the Federal Reserve in the United States, but also by other central banks around the world. That sort of a group of people get together and they meet and they sort of announce what they're going to have the interest rate try to be. That is not a competitive market like we have in other things, right? There is not some meeting where people get together and decide what the price of a sandwich is. So, what is it about interest rates that's different? And should it be different, or should we just have interest rates be treated like any other price?
Well, that's a big question, but all the time that we have kind of central banks that are trying to kind of target inflation, the means through which they try to adjust aggregate demand to reflect what they're trying to achieve with inflation. They only have kind of monetary levers, and obviously pulling those monetary levers affects underlying interest rates, which then kind of feeds through to everybody else. So there was a great paper from Larry Summers quite recently where he basically said, if you account for the fact that the price of interest rates have gone up dramatically as a result of monetary tightening to try and see off inflation, and the fact that the cost of taking out a new mortgage or taking out a new auto loan or whatever has gone up so dramatically. Once you account for that and kind of add that into an index of prices combined with consumer prices, you can kind of explain why there's so much angst about the economy, which you might not see if you might not expect if you just looked at consumer price inflation, which is now kind of heading back towards its target. So you're right, this is a kind of different price in that it's strongly influenced by what's going on with monetary policy. I think it's part of people's cost of living, self-evidently. Um, but one of the crucial things that we try to explain in the book is that we have to distinguish between the cost of living and inflation. So inflation is a macroeconomic phenomenon that is really determined at any given time by the balance between the growth in the money supply, the money in circulation, chasing goods and services, and the amount of production in the economy. And for various different reasons, because of various economic costs, we want to try to keep the kind of trend of money growth relatively stable over time, so that we get a relatively stable increase in the price level. But people's cost of living is clearly influenced by a whole bunch of other stuff, including the monetary adjustments we make to try and hit those inflation targets, including by taxes and spending undertaken by the federal government. But we have to keep those two kind of concepts somewhat distinct. And I think one of the reasons why you get a lot of confusion, a lot of calls for price controls, is because a lot of the public think of inflation as just about their costs of living, which is why you get like many people who seem to believe that kind of lowering interest rates lowers inflation, or lowering taxes lowers inflation, or increasing government benefits to people in tough times somehow ameliorates inflation, because they're thinking of inflation as really their ability to finance certain living costs, and that's not quite right. Obviously, there's a strong relationship between inflation and the cost of living, but they're very different economic concepts.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more, because I do think that is something that people get confused on. So obviously we have like the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of the Consumer Price Index, and it's this big basket of all these different goods that people buy, and they weight them differently based on people's spending habits and so on. And then they put out the year-over-year change in the price index, and that's usually what we call inflation. There's other ways to keep track of inflation too. The Federal Reserve uses the PCE index. But you know that's what people usually mean when they say inflation. Um, so there's one sense in which that's not quite right, because really that's a measurement of inflation. The actual inflation is the increase in the money supply relative to the amount of goods that are in the economy. But there's another sense in which people use inflation because, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps like a zillion different price indices for a zillion different individual goods. So you can have like the price of apples, and you can look at the price of apples over time, and you can see if apples are getting more or less expensive over time. And then you can say, oh, if it gets more expensive, then we have inflation in the price of apples. But what you're saying is that's not really inflation, or at least that's not what economists mean when they talk about inflation. That's a change in a relative price. But obviously, from a consumer's perspective, apples got more expensive. It's no different than apples get more expensive, or everything gets more expensive. Either way, things are getting more expensive. So, what do you think is like the right way to use the word inflation in a way that is both consistent with economic theory, but also makes sense in the real world?
Yeah, so the way that I like to distinguish it is to basically say inflation is a rise in the general price level, which in the medium term means a proportionate rise in all prices across the economy, which is really akin to what we're trying to get at, which is what you alluded to, which is a decline in the value of a money unit, and in this case, a dollar. So a dollar being able to purchase fewer goods and services than before. And that manifests itself in a rise in the general price level. You're right, though. We cannot observe that directly, so we have to try and proxy for it by constructing these price indices, which, as you say, are reflect a weighted average of our spending on particular goods and services. Look at those individual prices and use that weighted average measure to try and get like a measure of the overall price level. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that price index, whether it be the consumer price index or the PCE, which is slightly better at doing this, might not reflect underlying inflation. It can be, for example, that you get kind of quality adjustments that are not picked up. You can get sharp changes in people's consumer spending habits that are kind of delayed or lagged in being accounted for within those indices. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why quite often those consumer indices might reflect changes in relative prices rather than change in the overall price level. And by relative prices, I mean the change of like one good in comparison to another. But one reason why I think this is kind of leads to confusion is because a lot of even financial commentators, economic commentators, when they write about inflation, they write about the consumer price index or the PCE as being inflation. And that lends itself to the confusion that you implied, which is that people can then look at what people do is they take the overall index, they then look at the individual subcomponents. And if there's a month in which, the weighted average of prices has gone up by, over a year, 3%, say, and Apple prices have gone up by 20%, they will say that like Apple prices have been driving inflation. Right? So they will imply that like Apple prices are determining inflation. And given the explanation I've just made, that kind of makes no sense, right? Because the individual Apple price is actually a combination of the relative price change in apples relative to other goods and services plus inflation. It's a bit like saying 3 equals 2 plus 1, therefore 1 is driving 3. Like it kind of just doesn't make any sense. And let me give you a kind of quick example to show why this kind of doesn't make sense. So let's suppose that all of a sudden there's an increase in demand for a particular good or service and its price goes up. Well, in the absence of consumers spending more, there being more money out there chasing goods and services through increased spending, me spending more on one good or service means that I have less money left over to spend on other goods and services, which reduces demand and reduces prices in those sectors. Which, to a first approximation, if my total spending is the same, would keep overall inflation at the same level that it would have been before. So the only way really that you get an inflation, which is an increase in the general price level, is if you have an increase in total spending relative to production. And I think a lot of this confusion stems from the fact that people think of inflation as just the weighted average of individual price changes, rather than thinking that when we're trying to measure those things, what we're really trying to get at is decline in the value of the dollar unit.
And then one last sort of price that sort of feels like a different kind of price than other prices is wages. The price of compensation for workers. It doesn't have to just be wages. It can include benefits and other things that workers get. But it seems different when you're talking about paying someone for their labor rather than paying a producer for a good. What is it? Do you think? First of all, why do you think it does feel different? Because I think most people sort of feel that way, and I don't think it's completely unjustified. But why do you think that people do feel different about that? And then what does that mean in terms of how that price is determined and how that price is set? Do we treat the price of labor different than we treat the price of apples or bananas or something?
That's a great question. So I've been thinking about it a bit in the context of inflation. So under the definition of inflation that I've just been talking about, is that in the medium term, inflation manifests itself through an increase in all prices. Well, wages are a price of labor. So over time, at least in the longer run, all prices increase by a proportionate amount, including people's wages. But there's a lot of good survey evidence, particularly from Stephanie Stancheva, that suggests that whereas people see increases in product prices as reflective of inflation, people think that their own wages go up as a result of them becoming better at their jobs and like deserving a pay rise, rather than their wages going up because of underlying inflationary pressure. So you're right that we do tend to, even in that context, think of wage prices as different from other prices in the economy. I guess the underlying philosophical reason why might just be because kind of individuals are unique, and so we kind of don't like to consider ourselves the supply and demand for our our services as being like part of a cog in a broader market and determined by broader forces. We think it's about our own inherent brilliance in the job that we're doing, and what we think our subjective valuation of what we deserve. Evidently, we do treat wages slightly differently in some ways. From a public policy perspective, we tend to think it's better for people to be working than not working. So we deliver various subsidies like the earned income tax credit to try and top up people's wages, which actually pushes down underlying market wages but helps get more people into the labor force than otherwise. And of course, since 1938, we've had a federal minimum wage, and we've got a lot of state and local minimum wages that essentially try to put an hourly kind of wage floor. And the kind of thinking there is that that absent those minimum wages, employers have some kind of underlying market power. There's asymmetric information between employees and employers, and employers know more about the underlying market rates. And so therefore, in the absence of that wage floor, certain employers would exploit certain employees. Now, we can kind of debate how true that is, but certainly as a result of the inherent dynamics of labor markets, we do treat wages slightly differently when it comes to public policy.
Yeah, and businesses treat wages differently too, because businesses are very unlikely to sort of cut wages for everyone in a company if they need to save on expenses. They would rather just completely lay off some workers and then keep pay for the ones you keep, roughly the same. Usually, businesses believe that that's going to work out better for them than keeping all of the same number of people, but reducing all of their wages by a smaller percentage or something like that. And there is a sense, like you said, of people sort of believe that their wage should always be going up the longer that they are somewhere, right? Regardless of what it is, and we do companies actually do that. There are all sorts of seniority based pay scales that pay people more just for being around longer. And there is a sense in which I think companies feel a sort of responsibility to their employees in a way that they don't feel a responsibility to like the suppliers of the inputs to production, physical goods that they use for inputs to production. Where they'd be perfectly happy to negotiate a lower price for that kind of stuff, but they don't feel that way usually about employees. And usually, if word gets around that they do feel that way about employees, that's not a place people want to work.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And part of the wage setting process is obviously try and to hire the best productive workers and get the most from them. So you have to have them well motivated. So to the extent that these kind of social mores are embedded within how wages are set, you kind of get that effect. I think something that you said in the previous question though is really crucial. People tend to think about just the hourly pay rate or the salary when they think of pay for their job, but actually extends much more than that. Is remuneration includes non-wage benefits like healthcare provision and stuff. Obviously, that's part of the compensation package, but it quite often also includes returns to different amenities that are provided by the employers, right? The quality of the workplace, the free coffee, the free tea, like the gym downstairs. There's all sorts of different ways in which employees are kind of compensated indirectly like that. And one of the things that we're kind of learning more over time, particularly when it comes to the minimum wage, is when governments seek to control wages through the imposition of wage floors. Historically, we've tended to look at the trade-offs there between, higher pay rates for people that maintain their jobs and hours against jobs and hours lost through those kind of cuts that you talked about, or less hiring as a result of firms' fixed labor costs going up through the imposition of the minimum wage. But there's a growing literature now that actually recognizes that when the minimum wage goes up, there are a whole host of other margins in which employers can adjust, including cutting non-wage benefits, including, replacing less experienced employees with more experienced employees, so changing the balance of who is hired, and reducing some of the quality of the workplace, whether that be investing less in amenities at work or sweating their employees harder, imposing productivity targets, giving less in the way of bathroom breaks, and a whole range of other things. So there are a host of different margins on which employers can adjust, and not all of them are great for the workers. So this, even if many workers keep their jobs and hours with a minimum wage hike, at least some of that is offset by the fact in many workplaces that employers make these other adjustments, which can make working there less pleasant.
All right, the book is called War on Prices. It is edited by Ryan Bourne. Definitely want to check it out. Each chapter is on a different topic about prices. You can learn about history of price controls. You can learn about the economic theory behind it. You can sort of get debunking of some common myths about prices. Ryan has a chapter about the pink tax that we published in National Review a little while ago. And so there's all sorts of good stuff in there. It's the sort of book that you can go back and reference later when new topics come up, and it'll still be enriching and rewarding for you to do that. So War on Prices, Ryan Bourne, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.